Julian Becker never thought much about the politics of shoreline real estate. He didn't need to. For over 10 years, he'd managed a narrow waterfront parcel on Lake Ellison with the precision and quiet stubbornness of someone who hated disruptions more than he hated people. The land wasn't glamorous, but it was positioned perfectly. A deep water cove, shielded from the weekend tourist traffic with just enough elevation to protect it from spring floods. To anyone else, it was an unremarkable slip of shoreline. To Julian, it was control. Over routine, over access, over what came and went without him needing to ask or answer to anyone. The dock, the hoist, the inventory registry, the limited-use zoning contracts, all meticulously maintained and renewed. No one questioned his role because no one needed to. It all ran quietly, like Julian himself. 3 years ago, a quiet but significant request came through a third-party trustee, involving the restoration and storage of a vintage 1968 Chris Craft Continental. The boat arrived in pieces, though carefully preserved, and Julian supervised its slow rebirth with uncharacteristic attention. He didn't know who exactly the owner was. The documents led to a shell corporation, which led to a blind trust. But he understood enough to stay silent. Only when the boat was complete did the final letter come, typed and unsigned. Hold dock slot number 3A, open from July 10th through July 14th. Discretion mandatory. Owner will arrive unannounced. Julian didn't ask for clarification. He just tightened the security settings on the dock cameras and locked down his scheduling system. What he didn't anticipate was how quickly a pattern, once established, could begin to unravel. On the morning of July 9th, precisely 1 day before the window, Julian arrived at the lot to find the dock gate ajar and the water unusually still. The hoist sat empty. Slot, Tree A. Vacant. For a moment, he thought maybe it had been moved for maintenance, but a quick scan of his checklist told him otherwise. He hadn't authorized any movements. He hadn't even allowed visitors this week. Then he spotted it. A slip of paper, laminated and zip-tied to the dock post, already bleached pale by the sun. It read, HOA Patrol, Emergency Removal. Violation 17C, Contact Office for Resolution. No phone number, no address, no HOA listed, and no name, just a signature, scrawled and barely legible. Officer Dell. Julian stood there for several minutes, unreadable as always, the paper flapping softly in the lake breeze. He didn't curse, he didn't shout. He just felt something inside him, a kind of cold, deliberate fury, begin to calculate. Because this dock, this land, this shore, none of it was under HOA control. He had fought that battle a decade ago, when the neighborhood first tried to roll his property into their architectural covenants and waterfront bylaws. And he had won. There were court records and county agreements to prove it. More than that, there were municipal service exceptions, boundary carve-outs, and registered exclusions tied to this exact GPS plot. His land was clean, autonomous, unassailable. So who the hell had touched his dock and his client's boat? He checked his messages. Nothing, no calls, no alerts. He logged into the dock system's remote panel. Slot 3. A had been marked as in transit by an override command entered at 3:41 a.m., with a location code tagged simply as outbound. That tag shouldn't exist. It wasn't in his system. It wasn't even in the software's schema. He pulled the event logs, but the IP that initiated the override wasn't one of his. It wasn't internal, and it was masked, rerouted through a virtual node somewhere in Denver. That's when Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years: interference. The kind that wasn't sloppy, the kind that knew just enough about the system to slide in, extract what it wanted, and leave behind a mess that looked like a mistake. He didn't like it. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it meant someone had studied him. His process, his routines, his absence windows, his gate schedules. This wasn't theft. This was orchestration, and whoever orchestrated it knew exactly who the boat belonged to. By noon, Julian had compiled every document he could find: the original exclusion agreement with the city, 3 renewals of his shoreline access permit, dock system access logs from the past 72 hours, and printed images from the trail cam. Posted at the tree line leading into the service road. It was grainy, but at 3:39 a.m., 2 minutes before the override code was entered, the camera caught a large, flatbed truck turning off its lights and rolling down toward the dock. The vehicle was unmarked, though something reflective was briefly visible on the passenger side door. A square patch, likely magnetic, just large enough to pass as a fake seal in the right lighting. He stared at the timestamp, then at the sequence of frames showing the truck idling, reversing, aligning with the hoist. Someone had known exactly what to do and how to do it fast. The boat was on that truck in under 6 minutes. Not a scrape, not a broken cable. Precise, professional. Julian drove first to the city office that handled marina permits and dock allocations, not because he expected answers, but because that was where the paper trail would most likely begin to fracture. He was right. The clerk behind the desk, a man in his 50s with clear fatigue behind his forced smile, took one look at the HOA patrol slip and furrowed his brow. "That's not one of ours," he said, already reaching for a binder of verified contractors. HOA doesn't have enforcement rights over this section of shoreline, especially not since the 2013 reassessment. This would have needed to go through either public safety or the Department of Environmental Monitoring. "But there's no active orders this week," Julian explained, carefully, factually, what had happened, showing the dock logs and the override timestamp. The clerk's mood changed the moment Julian mentioned the untraceable IP and the outbound status tag. He leaned in slightly, lowered his voice. "If you're being flagged through the back end of your own system, and the physical removal came with fake HOA branding, you need to consider something else. This wasn't about a violation. This was a lever, a clean one. The paper looks official enough to spook a bystander, but vague enough to stall anyone who knows procedure. The whole thing's structured to avoid blame." When Julian pressed further, the clerk only added, "I'd suggest you talk to the Lake District Administrator. If anyone outside the city might have authorized temporary seizure or had advance knowledge of a scheduled removal, even under the table, it'd come through them. But off the record, this smells like a proxy pull. Someone wanted that boat gone fast and quietly and used HOA aesthetics to avoid oversight. It's a common tactic, not legal, but common." That word, proxy, kept ringing in Julian's mind as he left. Proxy meant delegation. Proxy meant plausible deniability. Proxy meant someone further up the food chain was working behind a firewall of third-party actors. If the HOA wasn't actually involved, and he knew they weren't because his land wasn't under their jurisdiction, then someone had used their image as camouflage, which begged the question, why make it look like a bureaucratic overreach unless you wanted the owner to assume it was benign? He didn't stop to eat. He didn't return calls. He didn't check emails. His attention tunneled entirely onto the single physical lead he hadn't exhausted. The tracking stamp burned into the underside of the slip left on the dock. A red alphanumeric code, hard to see unless held against the light. It looked like a batch code used by small-scale logistics firms, the kind that sublease trucks for odd-hour jobs and rarely keep clean digital logs. Julian drove 2 counties over to a warehouse yard he remembered from his time installing equipment for water utility contractors. He didn't know if the code would match, but it was the kind of place where unmarked vehicles came and went under loose oversight, and the kind of place where a quiet inquiry could go further than a legal subpoena. He was lucky. A gate supervisor, a woman in her 40s with a crooked jaw and a long memory, recognized the code. She remembered the job, remembered the flatbed, remembered the man who signed for it. No name, of course, just a printout, signed Del H., with no additional info. But she also remembered that the truck never returned. We rent to them sometimes. They bring their own operators. This time, no drop-off, just a clean haul. They paid cash, big bills, left no ID. Julian asked where the truck had gone. The woman hesitated, then checked her clipboard. They logged the route as a westbound drop to a secured maintenance facility near Hill Point. That's where private impounds usually go when they're waiting on ownership clarification or legal release. Problem is, that facility's leased, not city-owned anymore. Sold it 3 years ago to a holding group that keeps changing names. You want the current manager's number? It was already after 4 by the time Julian reached the Hill Point storage facility. From the outside, it looked like a DMV annex. Beige walls, buzz-in gate, motionless cameras perched like vultures. A woman at the front desk confirmed they had a vessel with the matching specs, but told Julian he wasn't listed as an authorized claimant. "You're not the title holder," she said flatly. "You're just the custodian. That means we can't release it without trustee approval. And as of this morning, that approval's been suspended due to a formal review of navigational use violations. Your record shows multiple flagged entries for pre-dawn departure and unsanctioned maintenance outside of environmental compliance." Julian blinked once. Slowly. "There is no record," he replied, "because those events didn't happen." The woman shrugged. "You'll need to take that up with the registering body. Our system auto-syncs to the Lake Authority. We don't generate incidents. We process what's flagged." Julian didn't reply. He just turned and walked out, each step confirming what he already knew. Someone, or something, had created a synthetic violation history on a boat that hadn't moved, and they'd done it with a digital authority high enough to sync across agencies. What alarmed him most wasn't that the boat was still technically accessible. It was that it had been ghosted behind layers of procedural ambiguity, each more mundane than the last. There was no villain to call out, no agency to storm. Just paperwork, delays, routes, requests, all perfectly boring, all perfectly weaponized. And now, the real owner, the one hidden behind the trust, the one with state-level influence and a very personal interest in this boat, was due to arrive in less than 24 hours. And Julian Becker had just lost possession of a governor's weekend ride. Julian returned to his property just before sunset. The horizon dipped in copper and bruised gold, the lake perfectly still in that deceptive way it sometimes was before a storm. He parked his truck by the equipment shed and stood motionless for several minutes, eyes fixed on the empty dock. The space where the boat had once floated, gleaming under a tight canopy, ropes cinched in symmetrical loops, was now just water, rippling without meaning. The silence felt surgical, not peaceful, but clinical, like someone had sterilized the scene to erase every trace of consequence. He thought briefly of the owner's arrival, of how it would play out when a high-level figure stepped onto the dock expecting to see his restored legacy vessel and was greeted by nothing but an unspooled rope and a vague HOA note zip-tied to a post. Julian didn't fear confrontation, but he did fear implications. This wasn't just an asset disappearance, it was a move, deliberate and layered, and the longer he sat still, the further ahead the opponent moved. He opened his laptop at the kitchen counter, connected directly to the dock's internal network, and began combing through administrative logs. One entry had changed since he left that morning. A silent update applied to the access permissions linked to dock slot 3A. Normally, only Julian's terminal could adjust those parameters. But this new entry had been time-stamped remotely, authorized by a non-local credential string that mimicked county-level override formatting. It wasn't a hack in the traditional sense. No brute force, no malicious code, just a precision-crafted credential injected at the correct layer. Whoever had done it knew what systems would accept which types of authority and which wouldn't challenge the source if the data packets looked authentic. Julian leaned back from the keyboard and exhaled slowly, his mind churning not with panic but with cold logistics. If the override had been planted, and if the dock violation report had been backdated, then someone was staging an administrative timeline in real time. They weren't hiding their actions. They were rebuilding the context around them, so that if anyone did check later, it would look like Julian had failed to report violations, misused the facility, and allowed unauthorized storage. In short, it would look like he was the unreliable node. He knew he needed a witness, but not the kind who would speak. He retrieved an old portable terminal from storage, one of the first models he'd ever used for shoreline automation, and plugged it into the maintenance port hidden behind the security panel near the gate. The unit wasn't networked. It was pre-cloud, pre-digital standard, incapable of syncing to any modern systems, which meant it couldn't be tampered with remotely. It took several tries, but eventually he was able to extract a hard record of all manual commands executed on the dock panel during the removal window. The logs showed something that made his stomach tighten: a brief interruption in the local power loop exactly 15 seconds before the override was triggered. That timing wasn't coincidental. It was a bridge event, a moment of induced blackout to reset hardware clocks, the kind of trick only used when someone wanted to create ambiguity in timestamp order. In court, it would read like a system hiccup. To Julian, it read like choreography. The next morning, he drove to the lake administrator's satellite office, a quiet, converted craftsman house with wide windows and too many hydrangeas out front. He didn't have an appointment. He didn't need one. Inside, the receptionist was polite but unhelpful, directing him to fill out a dispute form for improper seizure of watercraft. He declined. Instead, he asked for the records officer, claiming he needed to verify a permit inconsistency before submitting his annual renewal. That at least got him into the second room, where a man with thinning hair and a habit of licking his lips every few seconds greeted him without making eye contact. "You said this was about dock perimeter zoning?" Julian nodded, opened his binder, and slid forward a printed copy of the HOA seizure note. "I need to verify who approved this." The man barely glanced at it before replying, "That's not ours. HOA enforcement notes don't come through this office. You'll need to check with the shoreline compliance team." Julian reached calmly into his bag, pulled out the maintenance terminal, and placed it gently on the table. "Then explain why the override on my dock code appeared in your API logs." That made the man pause. He reached slowly for the device as if it might explode, then leaned forward, squinting at the monochrome display. Julian watched him. Watched the moment recognition clicked. Watched the slight shift in his posture. "Where did you get this log?" "I generated it last night," Julian said, "from my isolated port. It's clean." "Can you explain why the credential used mimics a disabled environmental enforcement certificate that should have been retired 3 fiscal years ago?" The man swallowed hard. "That's probably a carryover. Sometimes legacy keys persist in the system architecture. It happens." Julian's voice was steady. "Except this one's reactivated, temporarily, for precisely 9 minutes. Long enough to trigger an incident report, modify 2 access parameters, and generate a remote flag on my property code. Then it disappeared." The man stood up abruptly. "I'm going to have to get someone else to look at this." "No," Julian said. "You won't." And then he left. He didn't wait for confrontation. He'd seen what he needed: guilt, fear, and above all, recognition. The override credential had been internal. Someone in the Lake District's chain of command had been used. Whether willingly or through coercion, it didn't matter. What mattered was that now Julian knew the rules of engagement had changed. This wasn't about removing a boat. This was about neutralizing him as a variable. They weren't just taking his asset. They were discrediting his control. By dusk, a new envelope was slid under his gate. It was crisp, cream-colored and unsigned. Inside was a printed notice of provisional rezoning, a vague draft version stamped "Preliminary Only," referencing a potential reclassification of shoreline plots between Docks 2B and 4A. His land, of course, sat in the middle. The implication was obvious. They were preparing to redraw lines. He could fight it, submit appeals, request hearings, demand delay. But in bureaucratic terms, delay was already defeat. Every day they forced him to play defense was another day they repositioned. Julian stared out at the empty slip again, his fingers tightening against the wooden railing. He had expected retaliation. But this wasn't retaliation. This was erasure. Methodical, slow, and executed by people who never had to raise their voices. He wasn't up against a person. He was up against a mechanism, and that mechanism had just started to turn. Julian spent the next 48 hours not reacting, but compiling. He moved without commentary, avoided calls, and resisted every instinct to strike back prematurely. Instead, he began building the kind of record that didn't live in one place. Layered fragments distributed across multiple drives, backed up to isolated terminals, printed into hard copies filed in obscure categories in locked drawers around his property. If they wanted to unravel his work, they would need to find every thread. He knew how bureaucracies moved, how slow they were when you asked for a copy of something they already knew was wrong, and how fast they accelerated when you forced them to validate a lie they hadn't finished building. His advantage was the same one that made him invisible most of the year. He understood the value of dull process and quiet details, and unlike his opponent, he had no need for spectacle. By the third day, he returned to the Hill Point facility, this time not to retrieve the boat but to request, formally, an itemized service log of all procedures performed on vessel ID number ELL-68891 since intake. The woman at the counter, the same one who had dismissed him earlier, now seemed tense. She asked if he had legal standing to request internal documents. He said yes, under standard watercraft stewardship regulation. She made him fill out 2 forms, then disappeared into the back. When she returned, she handed him a single page, sparse, vague, and time-stamped with a single entry. Received. Secured. Under evaluation. Julian pointed to the under evaluation line. By whom? She hesitated. Third-party compliance, not our office. Name? I'm not at liberty to disclose that. He didn't press her, not directly. But as she turned away, he noticed a secondary clipboard left beside the counter, partially covered but visible enough to reveal the bottom corner of a routing request form. It was dated 2 days ago. Destination: Dock Transfer Site 7. Temporary Access Zone. Authorization code began with the prefix ESE-21. A pattern he'd only seen once, years ago, while troubleshooting municipal zoning transitions. That code didn't belong to the marina. It belonged to the Office of Environmental Strategic Expansion, a semi-private planning body known for buying up lakefront property under the guise of environmental renewal projects, usually funded through silent capital. He had dismissed them back then as irrelevant to his lot, which had no development designation and 0 floodplain encroachment. Apparently, someone else had revised that map. That night, Julian drove north, not because he needed to confront anyone, but because he needed eyes. There was a hill above the transfer site listed on the form. It was scrubland, unofficial, never annexed into public trails, but it gave a full view of Dock Transfer Site 7. The area was lit, fenced, and manned, not heavily, but enough to register as restricted. He stayed in his truck, engine off, watching for movement. At exactly 1:42 a.m., a semi-truck backed into the rear gate, escorted by a security vehicle bearing the emblem of a now-defunct shoreline security contractor, a company that, according to state records, had been acquired 2 years ago by a conglomerate linked to the same holding group managing Hill Point. Julian didn't see the boat, not clearly, but he saw something covered and cradled under heavy tarp and crosswebbing, longer than a car and secured with freshwater-rated chains. The transfer happened in silence. No chatter, no staging. It was already prepared. By 2:04 a.m., the vehicle pulled away and disappeared down the service road. He took 3 photos through the windshield, enough to verify movement, if not content. At this point, he knew something critical. The boat was never intended to be impounded indefinitely. The violation had never been the goal. It was a pretext. The true purpose was transit. Temporary seizure disguised as enforcement, then relocation under infrastructure classification. That meant the boat, and possibly the land, were components in something larger, something pre-cleared and funded. And if that was the case, it also meant the trust that owned the boat had been bypassed, either by misdirection, technical rerouting, or, most dangerously, internal cooperation. He returned home as dawn broke, sat on his porch, and began assembling what he now considered a tactical map. There were 4 points of vulnerability: the override credential, the staged violation record, the rerouted storage entry, and the live movement to a reclassification zone. Each required separate agency interaction, and each had left just enough ambiguity to avoid formal inquiry. But together they revealed intention. Someone had simulated governance. They had borrowed the shape of regulation to move a private asset across zones without triggering liability. That wasn't just illegal. It was architectural manipulation, a map redrawn mid-process and stapled over reality before anyone could object. Julian needed confirmation, not in writing, but in conduct. So he called a name he hadn't used in 6 years, the private contact at the administrative office tied to trust asset certification. They spoke once, always vaguely when the boat was first delivered. He hadn't heard from her since. But this time the woman answered on the second ring. He asked one question. "Has the trust executed a transition?" There was a pause. Then, "Why?" "Because the asset is in motion." Another pause. Number nothing's changed. Why would it be? Julian didn't answer. She must have caught the silence because her tone shifted. What happened? He exhaled. The trust's name is being used to justify an unauthorized seizure and transit through ESE-controlled zones. That was enough. Her voice sharpened. "That's not possible. Those channels are locked. We'd have been flagged. Unless the system thinks it was you. What do you need?" "Proof the trust hasn't triggered any asset relocation in the past 7 days." "I'll get it. But this conversation didn't happen." "It never does." He hung up, the screen burning white in the morning light. His hands didn't shake. He wasn't surprised. But he was certain now. He was in possession of knowledge that hadn't yet breached the formal tier of awareness. And that was dangerous. Not because someone would silence him, but because they'd try to silence the facts. Reshape them. Absorb them into a bureaucratic sequence that concluded without ever acknowledging his role. That was the method. Leave no villain. Just narrative. By midday, an unmarked envelope appeared in his dock mailbox. No return address. Inside was a simple printout. A schematic of lakebed zoning redrafts, effective pending ratification. His parcel, outlined in faint gray, had been absorbed into a shaded corridor marked Controlled Development Buffer. The date of issuance, 4 days prior, meaning the plan had been in motion before the boat vanished, before the override, before the flag. This wasn't a reaction to the boat. The boat was the trigger. His dock, his tiny forgotten access strip, had become the hinge for a larger play. He stood for a long time in the driveway, paper clutched in one hand, wind flicking at the corners. For the first time, he understood that the end point wasn't retrieval. It wasn't even exposure. It was containment. They wanted him proceduralized, reduced to a case number, wrapped in review cycles and pending response loops until the moment passed. And once the trust was notified, once the owner arrived, all attention would turn to deflection. This never should have happened. It's being resolved. Administrative error. No further comment. Julian walked inside, pulled a legal pad from the drawer, and wrote 2 names, one of the trust's founder and one of the zoning liaison listed on the ESE form. Then he drew a line between them. It wasn't about jurisdiction anymore. It was about choreography. Someone was conducting an invisible negotiation, and he, the invisible operator, the man who never spoke out loud, had just stepped into frame. Julian knew better than to strike directly. Every instinct warned him that the closer he got to the center, the more efficiently the machine would constrict around him. The goal wasn't disruption. That would only speed up the consolidation. The goal was trace, making sure that whatever moved left enough behind to discredit its own pretext. So, instead of confronting the trust contact again or demanding answers from the zoning committee, he initiated a formal technical discrepancy report through the county's archival department, referencing a land survey conflict between the previous and current shoreline designations. It was a deadpan maneuver, bureaucratic on the surface but designed to trigger review layers. And buried deep within the report, he inserted a line that would force a real person to make a decision. Status of compliance parcel E14 under buffer map 7 remains undocumented following digital reissue of control zone schema. That parcel was his, and that map hadn't been officially ratified yet. If they responded, they'd confirm their awareness. If they didn't, he'd have proof they bypassed their own timeline. Within 12 hours, someone responded. Not by email, not by call, but by consequence. At 7:30 the next morning, 2 county trucks parked diagonally across the road leading to Julian's gate. No lights, no markings visible from a distance, but close enough to block access without technically trespassing. A man in a gray windbreaker and sunglasses stood with a clipboard, flanked by 2 uniformed workers who began laying orange boundary flags along the ditch between the road and Julian's mailbox. When Julian approached, the man didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "Routine drainage study. Pre-sweep for slope resilience." Julian didn't move. "Why here?" "County order. Shoreline integrity checks following regional buffer adjustments." Julian looked at the flags. "This isn't a shoreline." The man smiled, sharp and cold. "We were told it will be soon." That wasn't a reply. It was a rehearsal line. Something rehearsed for moments exactly like this. Julian said nothing else. He returned to his house and spent the next hour verifying that none of his networked systems had been accessed. His cameras, sensors, docks, and internal comms were intact. But at 8:41 a.m., a new notification appeared on his licensing terminal. Annual Water Access Renewal, flagged for review. No details, just a status. But that single line meant he was frozen. Unable to operate the dock, unable to perform repairs, unable to even adjust environmental compliance schedules without risking an additional violation. It was a perfect administrative kill shot. Not illegal, not sudden, but paralyzing. And because it originated from a system process, there was no one to appeal to directly. Later that day, a maintenance barge idled for 23 minutes just outside the demarcated edge of Julian's water boundary. No communication, no identification. It didn't touch anything. It simply hovered. When Julian stepped onto the dock and lifted a field scope to observe, the barge rotated slowly, revealing a white side panel bearing a temporary project number, L7/reserve. He checked the regional planning logs that evening. That number didn't appear anywhere, but the prefix L7 matched a corridor that ran 3 miles south, near the area the trust was known to frequent. That meant the barge was out of place, deliberately. By then, Julian was already receiving letters, not from the county, from service providers. His insurance broker notified him of a pending change in risk classification based on shifting land use categorization. His permit inspector sent an email stating that routine reviews had been delayed pending resolution of adjacent property conflicts. A local contractor he used for emergency dredging emailed apologetically, saying he'd been asked to redirect his services elsewhere for the time being. No offense, Julian, but we're being squeezed. It was the slow closure of every logistical avenue. Nothing loud, nothing final, but all with the same message. You don't own this rhythm anymore. Still, Julian didn't break pattern. He activated old redundancies, printed contracts with renewal stamps, duplicate documentation sets, private registry backups that predated digitization. He contacted a geospatial analyst he'd worked with years ago, asking for a side-channel comparative of shoreline draft overlays between this year's zoning proposal and the one submitted 3 years ago. Within hours, the analyst replied with a single PDF, a transparent overlay of the 2 maps. The shift was undeniable. Julian's parcel had been recontoured, but not in a way that suggested environmental protection. Instead, it now functioned as a pivot point. The new shoreline buffer bent unnaturally to absorb his dock into the transition zone, using his land as a connecting throat between 2 larger parcels that were previously non-contiguous. That meant one thing: his dock was the bridge. Without it, the continuity of the new shoreline wouldn't hold. It wouldn't satisfy compliance parameters for what ESE likely planned: a regional access corridor, perhaps for a floating platform, a survey node, or a private transfer zone. And that made Julian's resistance not just inconvenient. It made it structurally dangerous to them. Which is why, by nightfall, his landline rang for the first time in years. He didn't answer. He let the machine pick up. The message was brief, a woman's voice, calm, measured, familiar in cadence if not in identity. Mr. Becker, you've been a reliable custodian. This matter is not personal. We advise disengagement from this process. You are not the target. Your compliance is no longer operationally required. Do not convert this into obstruction. There was no callback number. Julian replayed the message once, then erased it, not because it frightened him, but because it confirmed what he'd suspected from the moment the boat disappeared. He was a variable whose continued independence created statistical risk. They were past legality, past ethics. They were already functioning inside post-event justification. All they needed now was a clean incident to wrap him in, something that would make his presence irrelevant. A security breach, a procedural infraction, an act of supposed sabotage. And that meant he had one advantage left. Nothing he did had ever been dramatic. That night, he took down his external cameras, disconnected his active surveillance feeds, and activated only his backup tripwires. No data, no recordings. If they came, there would be no footage to twist, no narrative to engineer. There would only be consequences. Real, uneditable, unabstracted. He wasn't resisting them. He was starving them of language. The storm broke not with thunder or confrontation, but with silence. On the 4th evening after the warning call, Julian walked the length of his dock and noticed a new detail. The water level markers had been shifted, recalibrated, as if someone had adjusted the measurement rods while he slept. It was subtle, almost invisible, but he had memorized every inch of that shoreline. The implication was obvious. By altering the physical reference, they could claim new data to justify buffer reclassification. If challenged, the proof would sit in photographs taken that very day, showing evidence of erosion or encroachment, none of which had actually occurred. That was how this machine worked. rewrite the baseline, then claim everything downstream as fact. He returned to his house, locked every door, and waited. And at precisely 2:17 a.m., the trucks arrived. No sirens, no lights. Two vehicles, low rumbling, stopping just short of the gate. He saw their silhouettes against the faint glare of the road lamps, men moving with the efficiency of workers who had done this before. They cut the chain cleanly and stepped onto the property as if they belonged. There was no rush, no nervous energy. They weren't thieves. They were technicians executing a task. One carried a stack of laminated notices, another had a case that looked like a mobile data terminal. They walked straight toward the dock without hesitation, as if the land had already been absorbed and he was the intruder. Julian didn't confront them with words. He had prepared nothing to say. Instead, he watched from the porch as they unfurled tape, posted signs, and began cataloging measurements under the dim glow of handheld lamps. They weren't looking for the boat. They were recording absence, staging a narrative where the dock had failed regulatory compliance and been scheduled for removal. He realized then that this was the end point. Not to hold the boat, not to crush him through direct seizure, but to erase the record of him ever having been legitimate. Once the paperwork showed systemic violations, everything he had, the land, the permits, the trust's reliance on his stewardship, would dissolve into a technicality. But what they hadn't calculated was his counterweight. At dawn, as the workers packed their equipment and left without a word, another vehicle approached the gate. A black sedan, quiet, windows tinted. From it stepped a man Julian had only seen in photographs. The governor himself, alone, unannounced, without entourage. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look angry. He walked down the gravel path, stopped halfway, and studied the dock with the precision of someone assessing damage not to property, but to reputation. Then he turned to Julian, his voice calm, almost resigned. "It's not about you. You understand that, don't you?" Julian didn't answer. He didn't need to. The governor continued, his tone stripped of the pretense. The boat was leverage. That's all it ever was. It's already been absorbed into the corridor project. You'll never see it again. And if you think exposing this will matter, it won't. These kinds of things don't unravel. They're folded over, sealed, and buried under committees until nobody remembers the shape of them. What you can do is let it end here. You walk away, you keep your name intact, and this place is written off as an acquisition oversight. Or you resist, and your life becomes a footnote in paperwork that doesn't even acknowledge you existed. The words weren't threat so much as inevitability. Julian realized in that moment that the governor wasn't here to intimidate him. He was here to witness the final stage, to see the erasure completed with his own eyes, to make sure the variable was neutralized not through force, but through surrender. That was the real victory. Compliance through exhaustion. And yet, as the governor turned to leave, Julian spoke for the first time in days. His voice was low, even, but steady. "Then, you've already made your mistake." The governor paused, glanced back, waiting. Julian held his gaze, offering no documents, no evidence, no theatrics, just the simple fact that he was still present, still watching, still outside their language. It wasn't resistance, it was survival. And in that moment, the governor seemed to understand that erasure wasn't complete. Not yet. He got back into the car, closed the door, and the sedan rolled away in silence, leaving Julian alone with the dock, the lake, and the faint smell of oil lingering on the gravel. By the end of the week, the property looked unchanged to anyone passing on the road, yet Julian knew it was no longer his. Not in law, not in function, not in the invisible maps that now described the shoreline as a buffer zone rather than a private lot. The flags planted by county workers remained in the ditch, leaning at crooked angles. The chain on his gate had not been replaced, and the notices left on the dock flapped uselessly in the wind. To an uninvolved eye, the place seemed abandoned, suspended in some slow-motion dispute that would one day be resolved in court filings nobody read. But Julian understood that resolution had already happened. The dock had been written out, the water rights absorbed, the governor's presence quietly omitted from every version of the incident that would survive in official memory. There would be no confrontation, no scandal, no explanation. Just the gradual silence that follows when language itself has been stripped away. Julian packed deliberately, not because he was fleeing, but because there was no purpose left in staying. He closed the shed, boxed the printed records, stored the maintenance terminal in a case wrapped twice over with tape, and placed a thin envelope in the top drawer of his desk. Inside were copies of the zoning overlays, the transfer site photographs, and the voicemail transcript he had written out word for word. He didn't send them anywhere. He didn't publish or announce. He simply left them where they would be found, if the time was right, if someone else needed to know that the pattern had existed. He had no interest in spectacle. His only act of resistance was preservation. On his last morning, he stood at the edge of the dock staring at the water, the absence of the boat more complete than ever. For a moment he imagined the governor sitting at the wheel, guiding it into the lake as if nothing had happened, as if the vessel had never been a pawn. He let the image fade. Then he turned, walked back to the truck, and drove away without looking behind him. The shoreline shrank in the mirror until it was nothing but light and distance, absorbed into the landscape the same way his name would be absorbed into paperwork. He had not lost loudly. He had vanished quietly. But in the pocket of his jacket the key to the safe held what the machine could not erase, the fragments of a story waiting for the moment when silence itself would fail.